rump Ukraine, which is inevitably going to be more right-wing than Ukraine was when it was the United States.
We'll be talking more about that side of things later, but right now we're joined on the line, I hope, by Mark Watts. Are you there, Mark? Can you hear me?
I am. Hi. Hello.
So Mark Watts is an investigative journalist and very prolific on Twitter, and you've been covering absolutely brilliant... Oh, well, I mean, I shouldn't say that really, but one of the only people to be doing thorough coverage of the National Inquiry into child sexual abuse, but it was originally called the VIPaedophile Inquiry. I wonder, Mark, if you could just take us through... what about because the original idea was to investigate VIPs. How's the inquiry been doing on that side of things?
Well, that's not quite what it was. I mean, that's what provoked it in the first place when Theresa May, when she was Home Secretary in 2014, announced this overarching inquiry into child sexual abuse in the country. It transpired that it didn't turn out to be so overarching as the word implies. But what provoked it were allegations that various VIPs had been sexually abusing children and basically had not been properly prosecuted or investigated by the police / criminal justice system. That's what provoked it. Once the inquiry finally sort of got going, it announced 13 different investigations into a whole range of areas, one of which is become known as the Westminster investigation, which is, in a sense, an investigation into the issue that provoked the inquiry in the first place. And what's been happening on that is that we've just come to the end of 3 weeks of hearings, taking evidence, listening to witnesses, talking about that issue, essentially.
Do you think that they have left no stone unturned with this? That there's now no VIP can use their establishment influence to stop investigation of their potential crimes in the past?
Well, there are plenty of stones that have been left well and truly where they were. Nonetheless, what has happened over the course of the last 3 weeks is there has been yet more evidence. First of all, that some specific VIPs were indeed sexual abusers of children, that there was pretty definite evidence, definitive evidence in some cases, in a couple of cases, and I think it's going to be impossible for the inquiry not to acknowledge that. But perhaps more importantly, when it comes to institutional responses to that, is there was a failure either by the police or by the criminal justice system as a whole, prosecutors and so on, to take appropriate action. And again, I think it's going to be impossible not to conclude that did happen. Now, quite how often that happens, is another matter, because, as I say, plenty of the stones have been left well and truly in place. But just to cite a couple of examples, we heard how, in the case of, say, Victor Montagu, who is the late Conservative MP, had been sexually abusing boys. We heard, in the course of 3 weeks, literally from only one abuse survivor testified, and that was Victor Montagu's own son, Robert, who gave extremely moving testimony about, some very frank testimony about what his father did to him, and the failure to investigate that at the time. But it came as a bit of a shock to Robert to find out many years later that his father was investigated over allegations made by one specific other boy. I think from memory, he was a young boy, I think of about 10, who made allegations against his father. And in a nutshell, his father admitted to them to the police, and yet the decision was made by the DPP's office at the time not to prosecute him and simply to caution him because he promised not to see that boy again. Now, Robert gave evidence to say that he is sure that his father sexually abused many other boys, at least 10, he thinks probably more like 20. But it's come as quite a shock to learn that the police and prosecutors knew that his father was doing this because he admitted to it in the case of at least one boy, and yet he wasn't charged. Likewise, with Sir Peter Hayman, who is the former MI6 chief, he became deputy head of MI6, was a diplomat, worked for MI6 for many years under diplomatic cover, became envoy to UK's envoy to Canada, High Commissioner to Canada, it transpired that the police did quite a thorough job in investigating him specifically over a seizure of diaries which recorded 45 volumes of diaries which recorded a mixture of sexual abuse of children that he had carried out, as well as sexual abuse of children about which he was fantasizing. It was a mixture of the two. But they were specifically sent a file to the DPP's office, as it then was, as before the CPS came into existence. And basically, his solicitor, Sir David Napley, had a friendly chat with the DPP the other day, a chummy chat, and they agreed not to charge him and just to caution him, just to warn him about his conduct. And it's pointed out in the course of evidence by the police officer who investigated that case that it was put to him, surely there were the guidelines at the time, so he shouldn't have been prosecuted, he wasn't making any money out of this. He said yes, but he was exchanging this obscene material through the post, which was what the subject of the possible charge was. He was exchanging this material with another guy who was prosecuted. The only difference was the other guy was a bus conductor. He wasn't some high-flying diplomat. And he didn't have Sir David Napley, who could have a friendly, chummy chat with the DPP, and he was prosecuted and convicted. Self-same material being exchanged, but the prominent person got off with it. So there was clear evidence that emerged in the course of the hearings that people have got away with it, who are occupying prominent positions. We've actually heard in other limbs of the inquiry about how there were missed opportunities to prosecute both Cyril Smith and Greville Janner. When I say we've heard in the course of the inquiry, I think we had heard that before the inquiry started, because there have been official admissions by the CPS that in each case there were 3 occasions when, as I say, in each case they should have been prosecuted but were not. So the evidence is mounting up of this kind of lenient treatment towards people in positions of public prominence.
But actually, Mark, sorry, but with Lord Janner, for example, several people have said that this accusations are malicious and have been done behind his back since his death.
Well, they haven't simply been made since his death, but certainly the allegations were denied in Greville Janner's case by Greville Janner at the time, because, of course, he was alive when the latest investigation was ongoing. He denied the allegations completely, and his son Daniel has continued to deny them, as it were, on his behalf since Greville died. And it has to be said that the inquiry has not... Well, we haven't reached Janner yet, actually. Janner was not the subject of this investigation. We haven't got that far yet. And I don't expect the inquiry will reach a conclusion as to whether or not he was a sexual abuser of, in his case, boys. But what we already know is the CPS has put its hands up to the fact that there were 3 occasions over the years when he ought to have been prosecuted on the strength of the evidence that was available at the time. Now, it's not the same thing as saying he ought to have been convicted, because, of course, the CPS cannot say that. They can merely say whether or not he should have been prosecuted. And during the course of the hearings, we heard from the legal director of the CPS, Gregor McGill, who basically added 2 more people to that list of people who today would be prosecuted on the same evidence that they got away with in the past. Those 2 additional people being Victor Montagu and Peter Hayman, Conservative MP and diplomat, respectively, added to the list that the CPS had already effectively given us of Cyril Smith, Liberal MP, and Greville Janner, Labour MP.
What about police whistleblowers and survivors, you could say, because some of them have had a terrible time when they've tried to tell the truth within the police? Yes,
well, that's certainly true, and the inquiry heard none of that because they weren't interested in hearing from survivors. There was literally only 7 survivors of Cyril Smith who were core participants in the inquiry, although we didn't hear from them in this investigation. We've heard from them in the Rochdale investigation, so we have heard from them in a separate limb. And one other abuse survivor as a core participant, but the only abuse survivor to testify was, as I mentioned earlier, Robert Montagu. What we have heard a lot from, though, so we've heard really from very few, or we've heard from one abuse survivor. There were abuse survivors who were frozen out of being core participants or witnesses. But we've heard from a few police whistleblowers. Not many, I have to say. Plenty of whistleblowers, police whistleblowers were stopped from giving evidence or stopped from being core participants. But we did hear from memory, I think it was about 5 of them, and their evidence is really quite extraordinary. In essence, what we heard time and time again was that people, members of the establishment, members of what I think one officer talked about, the upper echelons of society, we knew were sexually abusing children over many, many years, and we were repeatedly failing to deal with them. And there was one, I just remember one line that came out from Brian Collins, who investigated Sir Peter Hayman, who just made this reference to, best club in the world, 3 Knights of the Realm, when Sir David Napley went and saw Sir Thomas Hetherington, the former being Sir Peter Hayman, solicitor, the latter being the DPP. So one knight sees the other knight to say, please let my client, this other knight, the third knight, off. And he duly did. And this is a kind of repeated pattern that we see. And although the authorities are trying to sort of say, try and say there's not much to see here, and even nothing to see here, there's an attempt to say, I think a senior commander from the Met said she did not recognise this kind of description of Scotland Yard or of policing, even in the day, let alone now. But the evidence, I think the evidence is overwhelming that is precisely what the culture was like, that there was a sense that they couldn't touch these prominent people.
You mentioned core participant status there. I noticed that the former Conservative MP, Harvey Proctor, who was prosecuted, he's now also become a core participant, and quite a lot of the survivors have raised objections to that, saying that they do not wish to participate in an inquiry where somebody like that is given that kind of status.
Well, first of all, of course, he was prosecuted and convicted of sexual offences back in the 80s, and they related to teenage boys/men who were underage as the age of consent existed then, although not under the age of consent as it would exist today. He was given core participant status at a very late stage in this inquiry, just shortly before the hearings commenced. I mean, the preliminary hearings to this investigation took place ages ago. The deadline for core participants to apply was ages ago. Now, it did rather imply that the inquiry was going to hear evidence about him. That would be the only reason why it would be appropriate to give him core participant status. And we always knew that the inquiry was not going to consider Operation Midland in any way, shape or form. They were cutting that out of scope. So it wasn't at all obvious why Harvey Proctor was relevant at all. So having had the 3 weeks of hearings, in fact, we've not heard a word of evidence either for or against Harvey Proctor. Absolutely nothing. It's a complete mystery as to why the inquiry decided to give him core participant status. But of course, it's become a platform for him to make various points that he's wanted to make in his barrister's opening speech and indeed closing speech today, which are basically amounts to saying, I am completely innocent. And indeed, he wants the inquiry to declare him completely innocent, even though the inquiry, as I say, haven't actually heard any evidence either for him or against him.
So do you think it's fair for survivors of child sexual abuse to seriously object to him being in that position and for them to say, some of them have said, that they don't want to participate anymore?
Well, I think it's fair enough in the circumstances as they've unfolded. I mean, when he was given it, no one could know, no survivors could know exactly what evidence might surface during the course of the inquiry. And if evidence had surfaced that was highly relevant to him, then he would actually have a right to be a core participant. It's just that no such evidence surfaced one way or another. So there's no proper basis for him being given that status. And it raises enormous questions about the inquiry and its real ability to grapple with this in a fair and even-handed way. If on the one hand you're excluding police whistleblowers as survivors from being core participants on the one hand, but then on the other you're granting Harvey Proctor core participant status for no apparent reason, it doesn't look good, does it?
Also, Sir David Steele, this is one bit that did make a few headlines. So much of what's going on at this inquiry doesn't seem to get the traction in the national news that it should do. If you consider the power and importance of those people who are being discussed at that inquiry. Sir David Steele believed Cyril Smith, the child sexual abuse claims about Cyril Smith, but he did an act. Is that how it's happened?
Well, that's right. I mean, first of all, he's Lord Steele now, I'll have you know, not merely Sir David Steele. Lord Steele basically shredded his reputation when he went in the witness box. It was quite an astonishing day. He essentially, having dismissed, in television interviews, allegations about Cyril Smith as being tittle-tattle and that kind of thing, he went in the witness box and said, well, actually, I asked Cyril Smith, when allegations surfaced that emanated from this Rochdale alternative paper report, which in turn were repeated by Private Eye. I asked Cyril Smith about the version that appeared in Private Eye, and Cyril Smith told me, yeah, this is true. Suddenly, it turns out Lord Steele was admitting to the fact that Cyril Smith had admitted to him that he was physically and sexually abusing boys in Cambridge House Hostel. I think I've got that name right. It was a boys' hostel up in Rochdale. Quite astonishing, given that Lord Steele has been trying to tell people that it was all tittle-tattle and so much nonsense. It's a real example of that knee-jerk way that members of the establishment like to dismiss allegations, which of course do seem extraordinary, of eminent people sexually abusing children. And in this particular case, he was doing so even though he knew they were true, because the guy himself had admitted it to him. Now, you know that the media can really only get its head round some simple personality stories. So since that evidence was so self-damning, if I can put it that way, and the Liberal Democrats moved quite quickly to begin disciplinary proceedings against him, and indeed I think they've suspended him pending the outcome of those disciplinary proceedings, it's become a personality story for the media to grapple with. And while they seem not to have been able to get to grips with the mountain of evidence that has surfaced in the course of the inquiry, notwithstanding the fact that plenty of stones have been left precisely where they were in the first place, they've sort of focused on Lord Steele in the way that the media does. It's a personality story. And he probably deserves the kicking he's been getting, but it's not all about Lord Steele. You know, he's just a typical example of one of those people who nonchalantly dismiss these kind of allegations made against MPs or other VIPs when they've got no basis for doing so. And in this particular case, as I say, he actually knew the allegations were true because the guy had admitted it to him.
We've also had Prince Charles involved as well. Apparently financial and property gifts to the Bishop Peter Ball, Bishop of Gloucester, who I believe is now being jailed. I mean, maybe out of jail by now. And also in association with his twin brother Michael, who also was involved in ignoring abuse going on within the church down in Truro. So Prince Charles very close to these two, Peter Ball and Michael Ball, and yet and giving gifts of property, that sort of thing. I mean, it couldn't get much closer to the establishment than Prince Charles, I suppose, could it, Mark?
Well, no. I mean, the issues surrounding Peter Ball didn't come up in the Westminster investigation. That was dealt with in a previous investigation, a set of hearings we'd had previously, which was investigation into basically under the umbrella of the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, as I think they framed it. It is yet another example of various establishment figures closing ranks, if you like, around Peter Ball as he was initially investigated. And that seemed to head off that initial police investigation. Nothing happened. I think he got a caution at that point, and then they did return to it many years later, the police, and of course that resulted in a conviction. So, as I say, we actually heard about that in a separate investigation strand, but it repeats that pattern of prominent people dotted around the establishment who turn out to have been sexually abusing children, both boys and girls, or one or the other, and basically getting away with it.
There's also another MP called Peter Morrison, who was the personal private secretary to Margaret Thatcher. Right, I think it was the last year when she was Prime Minister. Some problems there. She apparently did not question the child abuse claims, and actually he was protected by both Thatcher, the cabinet, or all three, Thatcher, the cabinet, and MI5. So how did that all come out? That's more recently that one's come out, isn't it?
Well, first thing to say is that I think it's fair to say that in Sir Peter Morrison's case, the evidence that he was sexually abusing boys that surfaced in the course of his inquiry is not definitive. Nonetheless, there is evidence that suggests that he was doing that. And moreover, perhaps more importantly, from the point of view of how people in positions of power responded to those allegations, the fact that those allegations were live, as it were out there, was well known to the local party, to the National Party, all the way up to the Prime Minister of the day, Margaret Thatcher, and for example, the Cabinet Secretary of the day, Robert Armstrong, Sir Robert Armstrong, he was then, he seems to have made a peer, and also MI5 seemed to know something about it as well. We had some degree of insight into MI5's, what I call the paedophiles, literally the files they have on various prominent people that related to child sexual abuse allegations, which they did disclose to the inquiry. Of course, whether they disclosed everything they had is another matter. They certainly disclosed some material. And again, the material that they disclosed on Peter Morrison was less than definitive, must be said. But I think what will become an issue for what the inquiry panel will have to wrestle with when they come to write their report, which they'll be doing over the course of the next few months, is deciding whether the failure to basically alert the police or to make sure the police knew, because part of the rumour was that the police were onto him, had even picked him up at some incident involving a 15-year-old lad in a loo in Crewe railway station. I think where the inquiry will probably go is, why did all these various people that got these reports not make sure the police were well aware of them and were investigating them appropriately? And the suggestion is that they weren't terribly keen to do that.
Finally, Mark, this is an enormous scandal, incredibly powerful people involved. You would have hoped or thought that it would be covered a little bit more comprehensively by the national press in London. It doesn't seem to have been. There's little bits and pieces here and there. What are your thoughts about the way that the press has been covering this inquiry?
Well, I mean, obviously, we have got the whole Brexit saga going on. The Brexit date was fixed for March the 29th, quite some time ago, and sometime before the hearing date was set. I think it was pretty predictable that whatever was going to be going on to do with Brexit, it was going to be dominating the headlines. Whether people might have predicted exactly where we are is another matter, but it was clearly going to be dominating the headlines in March of this year. So the inquiry, in its wisdom, decided to put the Westminster hearings in March. I know some people think there might be a connection between those two things. I do not know whether there was, but certainly the coincidence is certainly there. And so that's part of an excuse, but it's only part of one. I'm sure the media can handle more than one story at a time, even though it often seems not to be able to. And what we've had is, I mean, I noticed in the early stages some ridiculously just inaccurate reporting surfacing in the media about what was going on with these hearings. And then, as you say, even though we've had some astonishing evidence, I mean, particularly from those police whistleblowers, I don't think any of it's been reported. I haven't even got on to, we haven't even discussed the witness notes from the Tory Dirt Book, which were also quite interesting, and none of that's been reported. The only thing that has been reported really since the beginning, since the sort of, we've got an inquiry starting, or hearing starting, which, happened at the beginning of the month, was basically the day that David Steele metaphorically collapsed in the witness box. And that was even then, I think, was only when the Liberal Democrat Party decided they'd better have a disciplinary process. And just on that, I noticed that in the reporting, it's often said that David Steele said he assumed the allegations were true. Now, he did say that at one point, but it's really missing the point. Far more significant than just he made an assumption was the fact that he said Cyril Smith admitted it to him. So the reporting even of that, I think it shows that the media's just not able to grapple with something that's a little bit involved and requires listening to a few hours of testimony, and if they're not there, reading a few hours worth of transcripts of the testimony. It's pretty poor, I would say, the coverage that's been. I
said finally, but look, you just mentioned there the Whip's notes, the Tory Dirt Book. Is that something that's already taken place, or is that still to come? Because that obviously is a very important part of all this.
Yeah, no, we've had that evidence. We had it from Michael Joplin, Lord Joplin now. He was Margaret Thatcher's chief whip for 4 years or so at the beginning of her government. And it transpired that he had kept a copy of his whip's notes from when he was chief whip. As I say, often characterised as the Dirt Book. It's a series of literally notes. And the inquiry lawyers, we are told, went through back catalogue, as it were, of witness notes from some 4 years, identifying those which were relevant, as it were, to the issues for this investigation. And, well, I think it's suffice to say that some of them were quite telling, really some quite telling glimpses of allegations and knowledge of what was going on in relation to certain Conservative MPs. I mean, including, for example, Sir Peter Morrison, who we mentioned before. I have to say, although I would reiterate, it wasn't definitive, it didn't prove definitively in his case, for example, that he definitely was sexually abusing boys, but they certainly had material, which I think the inquiry will end up saying they really ought to have made sure the police were aware of them.
One of the shocking things that's come out about this, Mark, isn't it, that actually the whips may have seen these sorts of allegations and managing to crush them as a way to actually control Tory MPs, to keep them in line and to actually discipline them to vote when they were told to on a particular subject. That was that they saw that as an advantage. I think some people call it the black book, don't they? So every MP would have a page in the black book where the whips have with a whole list of potential things they could use effectively to blackmail the MP to do as they're told.
Well, that notion, I suppose, in many ways sprang from the infamous interview given by Sir Tim Fortescue to a documentary many, many years ago. He was a whip in Ted Heath's days. And he basically, what you just said there is in a way kind of what he was suggesting that they did. But it was a kind of very vague reference. He sort of referred to, if an MP gets into trouble, it might be I mean, this is not an exact quote, but it might be a scandal involving small boys or little boys, I forget the phrase he used, then we'd help them out. And we'd also, because we'd help them out, would have them forevermore. Now, this essential point that Tim Fortescue was making in that interview was put to various whips or former whips who were called to give evidence, obviously, including Michael Joplin. We had Ken Clarke, a former whip. We had what's his name, Nick Brown from the Labour Party, Chief Whip, actually still Chief Whip now, I think. He's been Government Chief Whip over the years and Opposition Chief Whip. And basically all these whips said that they don't recognise what Tim Fortescue was saying. Well, make of that what you will.
Mark, how do listeners follow your work online? What's the best way?
Well, my Twitter handle is @MarkWatts_1. And what I've been doing at the end of each day of the hearings is going through the key points. So I've done a chain of emails, of tweets, day by day, a different number depending on what's come up during the course of the day, trying to highlight the key points from the day. And that's probably, unless you're going to pore through the transcripts yourself, which of course you can do because they're all available on the inquiry website, that will give you quite a good overview of what's been happening over the last 3 weeks, which quite frankly, you won't get anywhere else.
And how long is the hearings going on for? I mean, sometimes people take a very long time, don't they?
Last day, we had 3 weeks of hearings. Last day was today, and that meant we had closing submissions from some of the core participants, and basically the panellists sent off on their merry way to go and write the reports. I mean, they've got other things to do as well on other investigations, but they will be preparing this report. It's obviously a delicate one they've got to write. It's a very sensitive one. I mean, indeed, the very pressure that the police whistleblowers are talking about, quite frankly, the inquiry has faced itself, and I wonder whether they'll acknowledge that fact. But there are clearly very delicate issues involved, and they want to write this report very, very carefully indeed. I'm sure they write all their reports very carefully indeed, but this one especially so. I think there'll be a limit as to how much they really want to upset the establishment, I would have thought.
OK, investigative journalist Mark Watts, thanks very much for joining us. And Kevin Carhill's also here. I know you've worked with Mark in the past. What do you make of what you heard, Kevin?
Well, I think Mark was addressing the issue of the way the media is covering this, which it isn't. There's an issue of resources, but the focus, as ever, is on, high or big personalities. An immense amount of child abuse went on in children's homes, and some QC and the head of one of the child protection groups did a study, and they said, no evidence of anything. And it took me half an hour in the National Archives to find over 100 sealed files from dozens of children's homes. I mean, is the inquiry getting down to that level, Mark, at all?
I don't think so. Mark's not with us anymore anyway. What about Martin? What we get is an incredible picture of these three peers of the realm all sitting down and basically saying, well, actually, we can get a bit of an advantage if we help this guy get off. And even though he's a child abuser, we'll just turn a blind eye to it because we may be able to use it against him in the future.
Well, I think there's the general, the establishment sticking together and covering their collective backsides. But I think my take on this would be to mention the Kincora Boys' Home in Northern Ireland, where the evidence suggests that MI5 were using boys as honey traps to entrap various people. And evidence has come out in recent months that the boys that were abused at Kincora were then subsequently taken over to the mainland and were being used in other children's homes. So this suggests to me that the use of children's homes as honey traps for senior politicians has been an ongoing strategy of intelligence services.
This reminds me very much.
Hayman was not just a diplomat, he was deputy director of MI6.
It reminds me of the film Conspiracy of Silence, which was made for the Discovery Channel by Tim Tate, produced it, and that programme, Tim was paid his $500,000 for it, but it was never broadcast. That showed a place called Boys Town in America, in the United States, where children were being sexually abused, and then once it was decided that they were appropriate, then they would be then bused to Washington.
Well, that's right, and I think it's that this kind of bad behaviour, shocking as it may seem, is probably not as uncommon as people think at all levels of society. But the really interesting thing to me is its use as a tool of political control. If you've got a large trunk of senior people in various organisations who are compromised in this way, then they're pretty much going to do whatever you tell them to do, aren't they? Because they don't want to end up in prison on the nonce wing, do they?
No, Martin has mentioned Kincora. Kincora had a sub-branch, which I physically walked past many mornings, and the local people seemed to fully understand that vile things were happening there and would tell you, oh, don't walk that way, that's an evil spot. And the target seems to have been unionist politicians. Kincora was well within, the unionists.
This is for blackmail, basically.
Entirely for blackmail.
So the idea is that this politician is effectively a puppet, because if they start to step out of line, you can threaten to take them out through the Daily Mail.
Yeah, the Daily Mail was where they launched it. Because, you don't have the blackmail power unless you can get the media to run it for you.
Yeah. And that means, of course, that if you do the right thing, say, for example, voting for the Iraq war, then your backside will be covered.
Yeah.
OK, so let's also have a look at some of the other stories this week.